In this CSS Grid tutorial, we're going to get a fairly comprehensive understanding of CSS Grid in about 1 hour, starting from zero CSS Grid experience. Please subscribe to the channel for more free tutorials and sign up for the email list to get our paid courses for free. So let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to download the source examples from github.com. So I'm going to go to github.com, truthseekers/CSS-grid-examples, or you can click the link in the description, and then we can either download the zip or git clone the repository. So I'm gonna git clone it. I already have a terminal window open. I'm just gonna run git, oh well, let's change it to the desktop first. Git clone CSS grid examples, and then cd into the CSS grid examples and open up the folder, and we're ready to go. So now I need to drag and drop each one of the index.html files into the web browser, and I'm going to start with one, and I'm going to do all 7 of them in order. So enter for 1, another one for 2, and so on. Okay, so we have each folder opened in a separate tab, so we can just start looking at each one of them. So the first thing I'm going to start with is the simple one, and the index.html and the CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and open all those up. And then we'll open the style CSS file. And so we're going to first look at this grid one simple grid in index simple one. And it's basically just this grid class here, and then these classes. And it follows the same pattern for the entire, all of the projects, or all of the grids. So the first grid is basically just the simplest type of grid that we can have. It's got the class of grid and then 6 items in it. And then if we look at the styles, and we can see here that each of the grid items have a different color, and then this grid class here is just setting the display type of grid for that div, and then a background of light gray. And so when you just have display of type grid, it's going to automatically assume there's 1 column per row, and that's why we can see here we've got 6 items and then 6 items in the grid, each on their own separate row, and only 1 column, and they're taking up as little vertical up and down space as possible. Making things a little bit more complex, you can specify the height of each row, or patterns of heights of rows, and the number of columns. So we do that in grid 2. So if we scroll down in the index.html, we see grid 2, and then again the same classes, only this time we have 8. And let's look at the CSS for the grid 2. So here we have the same background color. We're displaying of type grid, only this time we're saying I want the first row to be 100 pixels and the second row to be 150 pixels. And then we're saying the grid template column, we're going to have 3 columns, each taking up like 1. This is stands for fraction. So the first column is going to be 1 fraction, the second one is going to be 2 fractions, and then the third one is going to be 1 fraction. So that means that this one is going to be twice as big as these, and then this will be, half as big as this. So we end up with kind of like a 25% here, 50% here, and 25% here, which ends up being 100. So if we take a look at the grid here, we get this one. The middle column is twice as big as these two, which is what we specified. And then we'll also see the grid template rows. The first row is 100 pixels. Here we go, 100 pixels. And then the second row is 150 pixels. We can see this is a little bit bigger than the previous row. But then after that, we haven't specified anything. So it goes back to taking up as little space as needed for the subsequent rows. And then over here, you can notice there's some white space. So that is how we work with grids or the number of columns and rows. And then I also have a couple examples here that you can comment out or uncomment and refresh to kind of see a few different ways to do this. So you can use percentages, fractional units, REMs, pixels, etc. to kind of customize each column or row as needed. Oops. So that is grid 2, and then grid 3 is showing you how to use repeat. So in this example, we can set multiple columns or rows to be of a same height. So grid 3, class grid 3, if we just go down to it, we see it's basically the same thing, only instead it says grid template rows repeat 3 200 pixels. So that means we're saying I want 3 rows in a row of 200 pixels. And then I want 2 columns of 30%. So we get here 30%, 30%, and then we get 1, 2, 3 rows of 200 pixels. And then after that, we don't after you've completed 3 rows of 200 pixels, there's no specification, so we get the minimum needed. So items 7 and 8 are the minimum height needed. So that is for repeats. And then grid 4 shows us that we can use column gaps and row gaps. So we've got column gaps here, and then we've got row gaps. So if you need a certain space in between each grid item, you can do that with the row gap and or column gap. So that's it. And then here, once again, grid template rows and grid template columns, which is nothing new. So that is the first project, and that is the very basics of how grids operate in CSS Grid. So let's close that one out, and we'll close out these styles and open up the number 2, which is currently row column start end 2. So I'm going to open up the index here and the style here. And let's take a look at the first grid in this file. So we've got grid row start end. Again, this is just a regular old div with a class of grid and then a couple items inside of it. And basically, the thing to look at here is that you'll notice that, first of all, there are a couple different lengths. So item B is very long, and it takes up 2 rows, I think. And then item C is over here, and it's like a different shape, goes a different direction. And then it's also like item A is underneath and behind item B. So how is that happening? Well, it's happening because you can explicitly set the location of grid items. So our first grid here, we just have display grid. We have it say repeating, so we're going to repeat 4 columns, each equal in length, and then we're going to have each grid row be 100 pixels with 5 pixels of gap between the rows and the columns. So if we look at the class of B, we see we've got the background green, yellow, and it says grid columns start at 1. So if we look at the grid, we can count each of the grid line numbers by just seeing each grid column gap. So this one is 1 here, and then the next one is 2, and the next one is 3, 4, 5. So we end up with 1, 2, 3, 4 columns but 5 lines. So that gives us the ability to start and or end at the beginning or end of each and every line that we choose. So when we say grid column start 1, we're saying start this item at column 1 and end at column 4. So where is that? Here's the start of column 1, and then 2, 3, 4 is where it ends. And then we also have a row setting. So grid row start 1, grid row end 3. So 1 is where it starts, and then 2, 3 is where it ends. So we can't see 2 in here because none of our items here are ending or beginning at 2, so we're not seeing any gap, but 1, 2, 3 is how that grid row is working for item B. And then if we look at item C, it's basically saying the same thing, only with just different numbers. So grid column start at 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to start here on this column, end to column 5. So this one's only one column, but it is going to start on row 1 and end at row 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And so on and so forth with D, E, etc. And then F, eventually it just starts, there's no styling or positioning on those. And we'll talk about the ordering and stuff in another section. But that's how grid row start and grid row end work. And then in grid row or grid 2, we're just going to show you a couple different ways to do the same exact thing that we've already been doing. So in the second grid HTML section, it's just grid 2, and then we've switched it to A2, B2, C2, etc. for the classes. So if we scroll down here, here's a second grid area. We've got the grid 2 with a display of grid, repeating one fractional unit 4 times for the columns, etc. Nothing new here. The only difference is the positioning of each of the grid items. So A2 has grid area 2/3/4/5. And this is the same exact thing as the comments above. So it would be equal to grid row start 2, grid column start 3, grid row end 4, grid column 5, or grid column end 5. And so you can take a look at the comments for each of these or try to do it yourself. So grid row 2 is the same as grid row start 2, grid row end 3. So it just assumes that it spans one row with grid row. And that's basically it. The grid C is the same thing as above, only with 1. And then here we could do grid column 1/3. So grid column start, grid column end. So the start's on the left side, the end is on the right side. So that's pretty much it. Okay, one more thing, you can span as well. I think we're going to talk about that. Oh no, okay, I've got it here in E. So grid column spans 2. Basically, this is saying I don't care where the column starts as long as it spans across 2 columns. So let's look at E, hot pink. E, hot pink, 1, 2 columns. If it started here, or if its natural position was here, then it would just span 2 columns from here to here, from the second to the third column. So that is span, and you can span rows as well. So I've got grid row span 2 for purple. So this purple is spanning rows as well. And then we got nothing for G and H. Okay, and we'll talk about one more thing. We're going to talk about it later in more detail, but pay attention to the white space, the gray area. That is the actual grid. And so generally, if you have like an item A and then an item B and C, item B and C, or whatever comes after A, is usually going to want to try to stay behind A unless some of the elements are specifically stated to be positioned somewhere else. And in that case, then things can kind of like get jumped around a little bit. But in general, think of it as, the next item is going to wait its turn. So we'll cover spacing and white space a little later. The next thing is overlapping or layering your grid items. So that's grid number 3. And here in the index.html, you can see it's the same thing pretty much. And we've got grid 3 class, and then box and A3, B3, etc. up to F3. So if we look at the styles for grid 3, we do have a box here, and that changes just ever so slightly. And then our grid 3 also has a background color and is the same old grid. And it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. And before we start looking at these comments, let's just look at the general goal of this grid. So we can see here that the items are overlapping. So the first thing that I did was we changed the opacity of these colors. That way we can, well, some of the colors, that way we can see them overlapping each other. So let's look at A3. A3, which is this item A here, it starts on row 1, ends on row 2. So it's just this one row here. And then it goes from column 1, the start of column 1 to the end of column 3. So 1, 2, 3. But we have item D here as well, which item D we can see starts at column 2, ends at column 5. So 2, 3, 4-ish, 5. So there's overlap. And there's definitely overlap because it starts on the same row, row 1. So in this case, we can actually set overlapping grid items. And I think should be a Z index here. So you can set the Z index property on each of the items to get, which one you want over which. So the Z index, and then by overlapping columns with the grid column and grid row starts and ends, you can achieve an overlapping structure like this. And so I wanted to show you an issue, and we can do that by reading these comments. So it says, first try switching the C3 class to grid row and 4. So C3, grid row and 4. So I'm going to save this, refresh, and we see that this middle column has actually collapsed. And so I think what's happening here is that it wants an item, or at least one grid item, to be fully within the middle row. And so if you don't have that kind of situation, there is another option, which is to set the auto rows, or the grid auto rows. I don't think we've actually covered that yet, but the grid auto rows will basically set every row that's not specifically defined to that value. So we'll say grid auto rows is 70 pixels, and then all of the rows will be 70 pixels unless you've defined the first rows in the way that we showed you how to define rows earlier. So this will change everything to 70, every row to 70 pixels. And then the other option is to just have an item in the grid, in that specific grid row, that both starts and ends in that row. I think it might have to start, one might have to end, but you'll have to play around with it. But from what I understand, we need to have an item that starts here and ends here. That way it's a single item completely contained in that row in order for it to not collapse. So I don't know why they designed it like that, but that's how it is, or that's how it appears to be. So anyway, that's just a gotcha that you should be aware of. So grid auto rows is probably the easiest way to solve this. So anyway, that is layering and overlapping grid items. Okay, so we are done with this file. Let's close out number 2 and then work on number 3. So I'm going to close these two out, and then implicit grid 3. So I'm going to take a look at the index.html and the style. So let's first just take a look at the row or the grid itself. So we have the first 2 rows defined to be 75 pixels and then 120 pixels, but after that there's nothing setting the next rows to be any height. So we already talked about grid auto rows, so I'll just grid auto rows here, uncommenting that will make every other row after that 250 pixels by default, except this one here, which takes up the space it needs. So if we were to comment that back out, this one is bigger only because we have some items down here that force this row or this item to take up more space. So anyway, that is grid auto rows. And then the next thing is you can set up a flow of column. So right here, we don't have the column set up. We just have one row, it looks like, defined. And let's go to the second row. Okay, so this is the normal grid, display of grid, row graph 5, and grid template rows, 175 pixels, meaning the first row is 175 pixels. Everything else is undefined, so it'll just take up the space that's needed. And these are really small divs, so there's not really a whole lot of space needed. So the next thing I want to show is kind of like an offshoot to this grid 2. It's like a grid 2 alternative. So we're going to comment that one out and uncomment the next one, which is basically the same thing. The grid template rows is still 175. The only difference is that, well, we also set up a column gap, but the grid auto flow is set to column. So this changes the flow to column, meaning the grid flows in the column direction. Because of this, we'll end up with one large row, meaning all the items next to it will also be 175 pixels tall, because again, it's only one row now. So let's save this, refresh, and now we get this. So all of the items are 175 pixels tall, and they're spaced, they're spread out across the grid in one single row, because they're spreading, or they're flowing in the column direction. So that is another option, or not option, but there's another variation of code that we're going to uncomment. So this one is very similar to the one that we were just looking at, only we have 2 rows. So now the items are going to flow into the next row, and then they're going to flow the column direction. So if we just look at it, we've got 175 pixels for the first row, 50 pixels for the second row, with 5 pixels for the row and column gap. So save, refresh, and now we get 175 and 50 pixels. So you can see the flow. It goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, etc. So it goes to the next row first, then to the upper row in the next column, then down, then to the next column, etc. So it's flowing down the rows and then in the direction of the column first. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and go to the next set of code. I think that's all for the variations of grid 2. So let's move on to grid 3. So the challenge with setting the flow to column is if you have too many elements, it will cause the page to stretch horizontally rather than adding new rows. So that can be problematic. So right here, I've got a grid 3 with 3 columns here with 1 fractional, 2 fractional, and 1 fractional. So those will change as we add more elements. So you can see how this middle one takes up a majority of the screen. But if we add more elements, so down here in grid 3, we can uncomment this bunch of divs here. So if I uncomment those, hit save, notice how these are going to shrink. Refresh, and all of these have shrunk because they take up, their fractions are operating on a smaller portion of the screen. So their fractions end up smaller. And so we end up with more over here. Again, because these first 3 columns are defined to have a specific width. And then these ones just take up the space that is necessary. But what happens when you keep going? So let's try to uncomment these. Save, refresh, and we get this really, so the fractional unit are now the same size. And again, it flows in the rows first, and then it continues moving over for new columns. So we end up with this scrolly, and it's kind of gross. So this is something that you should at least be aware of. And that, I think, is it for grid flow columns. And that's it for grid 3. So we are done with this implicit grid 3 file. Let's move on to the next one. So this section is naming grid areas, and I actually don't like doing this. Maybe I just haven't used it enough to be comfortable with it, but let's go ahead and just take a look because I think it's important to at least understand how it works, and then that way you can know what you're doing when you see it. So in the index.html, I think it's just the same old stuff. Yep, grid container with A, B, C, D, and F for the grid items. In the style sheet, we now are setting a name on the rows and the columns. So this grid template rows column, normally it would just be like, okay, we've got a row for 150 pixels, another row for 150 pixels, 4 rows of 150 pixels. Now we're naming them. So we're saying the beginning of that row of 150 pixels is named row 1 start. And then the after that, it's row 2 start, and then row 3 start, and then row 4 start. So that's going to look like, you know, this is the top of row 1. So each item is a line before and after. So this is going to be row 1, I think. Yeah, row 1 start, row 2 start, row 3 start, row 4 end. Oh, row 4 start, then row 4 end. So 1, 2, 3, 4. See, that's why I don't like it already. But row 1 start, row 2 start, row 3 start, row 4 start, row 4 end. Okay. Row 1 start, row 2 start, row 3 start, row 4 start, row 4 end. Okay, I just mistook that. But anyway, that is naming rows, and then we do the same for columns. And then now we can just utilize these names to start and end. So instead of grid row start 1, we use row 1 start, the name. So, and the same with the rest of this code here. Row 3 start, row 2, 4, etc. So that's how we have created this grid here, is using the named rows. Okay, so the second grid is we can use repeat as well. So the downside about that is that these have the exact same name. So instead of using row 1 start or call 1 start, we would do something like row hyphen start and then number 2. So it's the second row start. And then row end, instead of row 3 end or whatever, or row 3 start, I don't know, but this row end, this row end 3 here is just going to reference the third row end. So you can play around with it, but this is how we're able to set the second grid's elements. And we can see that down here. We've got item B adjusted manually. So item B, row start 2, row end 3, call start 2. So 1, 2, and then row start 2, row end 3, row start 2, row end 3, which I'm going to guess this is row start 3, I think. But anyway, that is essentially how naming grid rows and columns works. We can also use this grid template areas property to name like different sections of an area. So for example, we say header space header space header, and that's like 3 parts header and then 1 part sidebar in the first row. And then content, 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 sidebar is 3 parts content, 1 part sidebar, etc. for the footer. And so we end up with the ability to run different commands on, or different properties. So like with this grid column start, instead of saying, oh, start grid column start 1, grid column end 3, we can just say header start and sidebar start or something like that. So let's comment this A3 out, and we'll start at the top. So this one here is saying grid row start and end on the header, grid column start and end on the header. So A3 is yellow, so we can see how that plays out. Let's go here, refresh. I think it's this one. Okay, so we can see that the A3 with this setup using the names of the header, we're able to cover the entire header. And then there's an even shorter, a more shorthand way of doing this by just saying grid area header. So if I save that, refresh, oops, oh, and I changed the color to kind of show that there's proof that the update was made. So we've now changed the header and we're able to just use grid area header. And then this one will say grid column start, header start, grid column end, header end. So I'll save that, and this time it's brown. Refresh, and once again we get the header. So we can see there's multiple ways to do the same exact thing. Coral, this time with a grid column start, header start, and grid column end instead of header end is sidebar start. So we'll save that, refresh, and we get this. So lots of ways to do the same exact thing. And that is, I think, the end of the naming tutorial. Okay, so we're done with naming 4. So I'm going to close that and then open up ordering 5, index and style. And then we're going to close naming 4 out, and we're looking at ordering 5. So now we get to talk about whitespace. So this section is kind of difficult, and it kind of boils down to just be careful with your ordering and be specific if you can. So the first example of this whitespace is pay attention to item D here. And so we have item D. It is big enough, and well, it's the right size to fit in this section here and this section here, which are both before C. So why is it not flowing up to either of these sections? And the reason for that is because it needs to wait, or it wants to wait, until after C has been positioned, which comes before it in the DOM. And why does it want to wait? I believe it wants to wait because by default it will. So item C, I think item C, B, and A all have positions. Yeah, so A, B, and C all have positioning settings, and then D is just gonna wait unless it's specifically told to go to some specific location. So that is example 1. Let's look at example number 2. So now we'll notice we have item A behind item B, C, and D. You may think it's behind item E, but E is actually a row lower. So item E actually comes after item A in this situation. But anyway, item A is coming after item C and D. So you would think, maybe C and D are explicitly positioned before item A. But if you actually look at the code in the grid 2 section, which is again the A2 class, we can see A2 has been specified, but what was the ones that are before it? C and D. Let's take a look at C and D. We can see C and D don't have any specifications. So you would think, okay, well, based on the previous example, why aren't they waiting? And so I think the reason for that is because in this case, A2 is positioned after where C and D would have originally gone anyway. So A2 is starting in column 3, row 2. So column 1, 2, 3, row 2, and that is after where C and D would originally go. A, B, probably B-ish, C and D. So that means item C and D can go before A, because item A is explicitly placed after where they would initially go anyway. So I'm pretty sure that is why item A is why these items are able to move in front of it, when in this previous example, the items would wait for the item before it in the DOM to show up. Hopefully that makes sense. And then you can take a guess on what C2 would do if we added this grid column span 3. So I'm going to just uncomment this. We can see what happens. So if I save it, let's look here. And item C covers 3 columns now, which it was up here and it didn't have enough room, so it had to move down to the next row. And to span X amount of columns, it seems like is less powerful than, explicit location instructions. So with it just saying, okay, make sure you're 3 columns long, it's going to force D and E to show after it. Let's take a look at any more comments that we may have. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. And down here, let's go ahead and refresh this just to get a good start. So we're messing with item F. If we tell item F to have a start column of 3 and span across 2 columns, I think item G will still show up after it, because all we're doing is saying be a certain length. We are saying to start here. So if I refresh or uncomment this, and then let's comment this one, save and refresh. It may look like G is going in front of F, but it's actually behind F, because again, F is higher up in the rows. So again, it goes left to right. So this is the next column, this is the next one, this is the next one, and then after this one is this one here. So G is still actually after F. And I think that we can see that we're only pushing G back and not actually moving F behind where G should go, because if we move it back to where it was, pay attention to where F is here and where G is going to be when we refresh, when we go back to how it was. So if I comment that out and comment this, refresh, G is still over here. So I think we would have to move F all the way over here in order to get G to go in front. We can actually try that. So let's just try moving F down 1 more row and see if G will squeeze in front of F. So we got grid row span 2. Let's maybe say grid row start, and let's see, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's start it on row 4. Refresh, oops, and something happened. Okay, let's try getting rid of that, and grid row end, I don't know, 6. There, and now we get G going in front. But I think we've already talked about that, so I'm gonna undo a few times. Don't remember where I was supposed to stop. Okay, that should be good. So I'm gonna leave my F2 class just like this. Okay, so next let's talk about grid 3. And so here we'll notice that A is after B. And I think the reason for this is because item C is blocking item B's ability to be behind A. So B has a specific instruction to be this many rows long, and it can't be on the first, or it can't be in this column because C is also explicitly told to be here. So we would have to overlap, and I think overlapping is the last step. So it's going to override A's position and it's going to go in front of A. So let's just look at item or grid 3. So we have B3, which says start on the first row, and then A doesn't have any instructions. So this would normally go after A, but because C is saying, hey, also start on grid column start 2, which is 1, 2, which is here, it's going to be in the way of item B. So B, I think that's the reason that B is able to go in front of A. So I'm going to let you look around at that, but I've got some other examples down here as well. And so the interesting part about this is the only difference between this grid and the one before it is item B. So item B here in grid 3 says grid row start 1, grid row end 3. So it's telling us when and where to start. But in the next one, it's just saying, okay, span 2 rows. And so I think the span 2 rows thing is weaker because when we look at grid 4, now it is able to go move backwards. So we see here item B is actually moving into the 3rd column, which is really interesting because you would think that, I think that it's equally capable of doing this in this example too. I don't think D or E or G are defined. E, D, or G are not defined, so I don't understand why it moved here in one or moved left in one and then right in the other. So I think it has some kind of specificity. So that's just something to pay attention to. And I think my estimate is that spanning 2 columns is less specific, so it's able to move rightwards in the DOM or in the grid, and then the other one is more powerful, I guess, or else it has a higher priority. This one has a higher priority, so it moves left. That's just a guess though. I don't honestly know. And so I don't think it's necessary to spend any more time on grid ordering. I think the main takeaway here is to just, again, be careful with the ordering and be specific if you can, so you don't have to figure out all of this specificity stuff. So I'm going to leave the rest up to you to explore your own situation if you need specificity to be taken care of. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and move on. So let's go ahead and close out ordering 5. We'll close out these, and then we'll start on alignment in number 6. So I'm going to open up the index and the style. And so the 6th folder is all about alignment. And we have a basic grid here with 4 columns, and all the auto rows are set to 100 pixels. And basically, they take up the whole, like the item itself takes up the whole grid cell or item. So we can change that by changing the align items and or the align content. So if we were to do align items center, we'll save, refresh, and now all of the items or the content in the item or in the grid item is centered. And then we can do that with align self as well. So in grid 2, well, and you can also do end and start. I'll let you uncomment those as you please. So grid 2, we have nothing set, but then each of these items, we have align self start. So that's why this is up at the top. This one has no setting, so it stretches by default to fill the whole grid cell. Align self end, align self center, align self end, and start. So center, end, start, and then nothing to stretch. So this is align self, and you're aligning elements on the block axis. And then we can add in justify as well, so we can get justify and align. And so while align items helps us align things vertically, or the block axis, justify helps us on the inline axis. So combining the two together, we can get just about any alignment we want. We can center things in the absolute vertical and horizontal middle. You can do bottom right, bottom center, upper left, etc., or nothing at all and have it stretch. Or we could just justify to the left and have it stretch all the way vertical, but be all tucked to the left or the center or the right. So a lot of different options here, just with a combination of justify and align. So we can see that in grid 3, where we've got some things just justified, some things align and justified, and other things neither. So that's pretty much grid 3. Very simple here, just justifying and aligning to get the centering and alignment proper, or the way you want it. The next thing is grid 4, and this is showing us different spacing options. Let's go ahead and go to the 4th grid, and we can see that in this situation, we're not aligning the items, we're aligning the content itself. So what do we want the content of the grid, like the tracks, how do we want those to be spread out? So currently we have grid 4 set center and center. So that's how this looks. All of the items, or in all of the grid, is smushed into the center of the grid. But if we uncomment this and refresh, then they get pulled over to the left. And why is that? It's because we have a grid that is a height and width of 750 pixels, but we only have 300 pixels worth of columns, and it looks like 300 pixels worth of rows. And so we end up getting this, the last row stretched to fill out the bottom. And so when you have situations like this where all of the grid content doesn't match or doesn't fit in the container, then we're able to align things as we please. So let's try align content end. We can save, and now we get it all smushed to the bottom. We could do align content space between, and we get them spaced between like this. You could do space around, etc. So there's really a lot of different options, and my goal here with this grid is to just show you that there's a multitude of options. So justify content, center, and space around. There we go. Lots of different options. So I'm going to leave it at center and center. And then, and then also I showed you, I think I've already talked about this, but this is just like, I think this is a grid column start, grid row start, grid column end, grid row end, or something like that. But we already talked about that. And D4 is just spanning 2 columns. So 2 columns here. And I think that is it. So let's move on to the 5th grid, which is margin. So we've got auto margin, which I think the margin just takes up the place of the spacing that would otherwise be there. So if we look at A5 in grid 5, A here, if we comment out this margin left auto, it's just going to fill this space. So if we were to do the margin left, it's just going to turn this side of the extra, well, it's going to take the extra spaces worth and turn it into margin on the left. That's kind of how I read it. I don't know if that's exactly correct, but hopefully these examples will kind of demonstrate how this works. And there's also the documentation as well that you can read. So the same thing with the margin right for D5. So hopefully this grid helps you understand margin auto. And then the 6th grid is just the difference between justifying items and justifying content. It's very similar to the earlier, like grid 4, I think. But here I just wanted to show you the difference between justifying content and justifying items, or aligning content and aligning items. So let's go to grid 6. So the easiest way I figured to deal with grid 6 is to have a bunch of different variations of the grid itself, just to kind of compare them. So we've got variation 1, 2, etc. So we're starting with 1, which has align items, start, align content, end, and, well, okay, so align content end and justify content end. And so that's taking the grid itself in the entire container and pushing it down into the right. So if we inspect this, let's probably make this full screen. So we see the grid is down and to the left. That outer box there is the grid itself. And so it's getting align content down, justify content end to the right. And then the items are what stays within the grid. So the fact that it's all the way down to the right is is what this justify content's doing. And then the align items, we're saying move all of the grid like item stuff up to the start. So align item start, justify item start, that's why they're all pushed up and to the left. And you'll notice here that we have this row that would collapse, but it doesn't because we have the auto rows or the template rows defined to a certain certain amount of pixels. So that's why they're not collapsing. And A is also taking up these these spaces here. And then item B is taking up this space here. So that's kind of the explanation for that. So anyway, that is the first variation. Let's look at the next one. So if I uncomment variation 2, the only difference is that we're saying align items end. So align items start, align items end, and then everything else is end to start end. So align items end is the only thing that changes in this one. So now if we refresh and look at the grid, we see the items are now pushed to the bottom, or the elements inside of their grid cells are pushed to the bottom, or the align end. And again, because item A, it gets squished to only take what it's needed, but then it pushes it down. So that's why it's pushing it down to the bottom of these two rows that item A and item B take up. So hopefully that makes sense. This is the entire area for item A to be moved around in, and this is the entire area for B to moved around in, etc. Same thing for all of these other ones. So hopefully that is making sense. Let's look at variation 3. So this one I've changed the justify content and align content to the start. So that means this whole container should be moved to the start. So if I refresh, here we go. Container is at the start, and once again, the align items is at the start. So these items within their space in the grid, it's moved up to the start of their containing area. So that is variation 3. And then align items end, align content start, and justify content start. I don't think, yeah, okay. So hopefully you get the picture. So we haven't, I think we got rid of an align items. No, we got the align items end. We got rid of the justify items. So because we got rid of the justify items, it's not going to shrink the element itself inside of the grid cells or the columns and rows. So that's why this item A, it's down at the end for align items, but it's stretching across the horizontal axis because it hasn't been justified. So that is variation 4. So align content start and justify content start. So that should be all the way up at the top, and then I believe it would take the whole space. Yep. So item A and B and all of the items now take up all of the columns and rows that they're supposed to take up. And they're actually filling that space, not just like having white space. And then variation 6, refresh, and this is everything. So it takes, so item A, B, and C, and D take everything, and then because the third row has a bunch of extra space at the bottom, the last 3 items expand to finish taking up the rest of the space. Okay, so that is everything for the alignment 6 folder, and that is done. We're done with grid 6 now. So I'm going to close this out, and then we're in the min-max section. So I'm going to close those 2 and then open min-max. Okay, so min-max is essentially saying, okay, this column or row can only be a minimum of the first parameters, width or height, depending on if it's a row or column, and then the second parameter stands for the maximum. So in this case, we have a column that can be at a max of 100 pixels wide and then a minimum of 50 pixels wide. So we'll take a look at the first grid that we have, and we can see that by default it will use the max. So if I'm looking at C, we have C is the third column, so 1, 2, 3. It'll have a max of 500 pixels. And so you can see that we don't need all 500 pixels here, but if we inspect, that's what we're getting. So this one is 500 pixels wide, and then if we look at the grid, it is also applying a 500 pixel grid, or width grid. So it's using the max by default. And then the other one here, the second column, we can see that it's full and it's still not going to go down any farther. So like in the index.html, we have it counting all the way up to 17, but we're only able to see 14 and 15 because 16 and 17 are pushed down and they're below this purple section. So they're not, it's expanding outside the grid, but the grid itself is still maintaining this row of 100 pixels. So it's not going to expand more than 100 pixels. And then the column is not going to expand more than 100 pixels wide because, again, it has to fit within the min-max. So if we take off this grid auto rows, it will expand down, but it's not going to expand sideways anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and uncomment that. So that's the first example. And the second example here, at first glance, it looks like some of these columns are using way less than their minimum. So like this A here, if we inspect it, it's only like 7 pixels wide and 144 pixels tall. But if we look at the min-max for the second column, or the second grid, the first column has a minimum of 50. So how is this only 7 pixels wide? Well, let's actually look closer at it. If we hover over this grid, we can see that the actual grid is still within the min-max. So if I comment out this justify items start, it's going to stretch to fit the whole grid, which is 100 pixels wide. So the first column, we're actually still using the max. We're just justifying the elements within the grid, which is something we'd already talked about in a previous section. So we're actually able to justify in the grid, and so we could center this in the grid, but we're still getting the max. So that's something to pay attention to, is that the element inside the grid may actually be smaller than the actual grid item itself. So we're still using the max here. And then another thing that I wanted to just try out is using Flexbox. This is unrelated to min-max, but I wanted to use Flexbox within the grid. So I was actually able to do that. There's probably some better ways to do this. I was just kind of playing around with it, but I have an inner E2 class. So in grid 2 here, within the grid, I have made another div, and then this div has a display of flex, and then and now we're dealing with Flexbox inside of the grid. And so we're able to customize and center 3 rows within a single, or 3 columns within a single grid item, because we're using Flexbox within the grid. So that's an example that you can look around at if you want to. The next example is grid 3, and this one is where we're actually going to talk about mins and maximums. So by default, it uses the max, but how do we actually get it to use the min? So the first thing we'll do is take a look at the actual height and width of the grid. So I'm going to go down here. I think this is the third example. So we have a height of 800 pixels. So if we look here, our grid will have a max of 800 pixels. And then in our code, we have the auto rows are set to a min max of 30 to 200. So the minimum they can be is 30 pixels tall. The maximum they can be is 200 pixels tall. So by default, we still have leftover space down here. So if we look at these grid items, they're 200 pixels tall. Except this one, which technically is still 200 pixels tall. It's just that this item inside of the grid cell is justified or aligned to the bottom. So we have 200 pixels tall by default. And then our width is 600 pixels maximum or 300 pixels minimum. So if we look again, we're getting 600 pixels for the width. So let's first look at the min max of the width or the columns. So what I want to do is I'm going to shrink the screen down. Oh, and you'll notice here, they're not getting any smaller. So we're actually getting scrolling at this point because they have reached their minimum size. So if I right click and inspect, we get 200 pixels. Well, that's 200 pixels tall. 300 pixels on the x-axis. So 300 pixels is the smallest, just like this min-max tells us it is. So this is the smallest it can get. And then with the rows, let's go ahead and make this bigger. We can see the effects of min-max by adding more rows because all of the items are going to try to stay within this 800 pixel container. So the only way they can do that once they've reached the end is to shrink, and they can shrink up to or down to their minimum. So I think again they were at like 600 or something. So rows, 200 pixels tall. So let's add more elements. So I'm going to go down to this one, and I'm just going to take all of the existing ones and copy and paste them so we get a second set. There we go, and you can see they're smaller. Let's right click and inspect. Now they're 129. So let's do it 2 more times. Save, refresh, and now they're even smaller. Inspect. Now they are 68 pixels. So now we can just do it a few more times. And I've got this. They're still not sticking out, but let's right click and inspect. 31, so we're very close. So let's add 3 more. Doesn't really matter at this point, but now they're finally sticking out of the container. And we can see they are a minimum of 30 pixels tall. So that is essentially min-max in a nutshell, and that also brings us to the end of the CSS Grid tutorial. Thank you for watching the video. Please subscribe to our channel and click the bell to be notified when we release new tutorials. Also be sure to like the video and leave a comment to let us know what you think. Lastly, check out the link or links in the description. We usually create a blog post to go with the tutorial, and we might have a newsletter or course or something to check out as well. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.